Hey everyone, and welcome to today's Explainer. We are diving right into a seriously fascinating journey today, looking at the historical evolution of fringe beliefs. We hear the word pseudoscience thrown around a lot these days, right? Usually it's used as an insult, just to dismiss someone else's ideas. But what actually makes a science fake? Is it the methods they use, the people doing it, or is it something else entirely? Today, we're going to unpack the underlying structure of these alternative systems of knowledge. And honestly, you might be surprised by how closely they mirror the exact same scientific establishment they're often fighting against.
So right off the bat, we run into this one incredibly stubborn question. How do we actually separate scientific fact from fiction? And this isn't just some modern headache we're dealing with today. It's what philosophers call the Demarcation Problem. It's literally the timeless philosophical struggle to draw a clear, sharp line between real science and fake science. And as we're going to see, finding a universal rule that perfectly separates the two, well, it's been an incredibly stubborn puzzle throughout all of human history.
All right, here's our roadmap for today. First, we'll look at the demarcation problem. Second, defunct sciences. Third, anti-establishment sciences. And fourth, mind power sciences.
Okay, part 1, the demarcation problem. This boundary battle over what counts as science is actually ancient. Take the Hippocratic text on the sacred disease, from way back in the 5th century BC, which discussed epilepsy. Early Greek physicians were actively trying to distance themselves from magicians and faith healers. Why? Well, because to establish their own credibility, they had to explicitly define what was not legitimate medicine. Excluding the opposition to claim scientific authority is a tactic that has literally been used for thousands of years.
Fast forward to the 20th century, and we meet the philosopher Karl Popper. He came up with the most famous solution to our problem, the theory of falsifiability. Popper essentially compared Albert Einstein's physics, which made incredibly risky, testable predictions, like exactly how starlight would bend during a 1919 solar eclipse, with Sigmund Freud's psychoanalysis. Popper argued that true science takes risks and, most importantly, can be proven wrong. Unfalsifiable science, on the other hand, is so flexible that it could just explain away any conflicting data.
So the crucial takeaway here is this. If a theory is perfectly flexible, it just can't be disproven. But philosophers pretty quickly realized Popper's standard isn't exactly flawless. Even rigorous, mainstream science sometimes struggles to be flawlessly tested. Just think about evolutionary biology or geology, where we can't exactly rewind time in a lab, right? And conversely, some fake sciences actually do make testable claims that can be proven wrong. So the line is still just a bit blurry.
Moving on to part 2, defunct sciences.
It's kind of wild to think about, but historically speaking, astrology in the 2nd century with Ptolemy and alchemy in the 15th century weren't fringe theories at all. They were the mainstream disciplines. Princes and royalty heavily funded them right up until the scientific revolution. They only became defunct when the 18th century shift toward modern chemistry and astronomy pushed them out of the acceptable scientific consensus.
So why did alchemy ultimately get the boot? Well, it leaned heavily on highly secretive codes and symbols. They would translate the images of snakes and birds into chemical steps. It fundamentally lacked a transparent, shared methodology. So when the new scientific era came along and demanded open publication and replicable experiments, alchemy was cast out and officially reclassified as a defunct pseudoscience.
All right, part 3, anti-establishment sciences. Now, when we look at modern anti-establishment movements, like ufology or flat earth theories, we find a completely different core belief at play, that the scientific establishment is actively hiding the truth. Unlike those defunct sciences that just sort of aged out of relevance, anti-establishment sciences operate on the assumption of a massive, deliberate cover-up. They view themselves as the true objective researchers who are bravely fighting against a dogmatic scientific elite.
And hey, if you're sitting there thinking these ideas are purely marginal, consider this. According to a 2018 survey, an unbelievable 1 in 6 Americans were not entirely convinced that the Earth is round. Let that sink in. This proves we're talking about a highly relevant, deeply embedded modern movement here, not just some medieval throwback. In fact, the whole idea of a flat Earth is a surprisingly modern controversy.
The azimuthal projection map used by flat Earth advocates actually centers directly on the North Pole. What's really fascinating here is how they utilize complex visual models and terminology to closely parallel mainstream cartography. They are literally mimicking the visual language of science to legitimize their anti-establishment claims.
A really crucial, kind of mind-bending detail of this alternative map is the outer rim. In their model, the South Pole isn't a continent at all. Instead, it's believed to be a massive outer ice wall holding all the oceans in place. It's actually a remarkably detailed countermodel that completely answers the internal logic of their belief system.
Which brings us to part 4, mind-power sciences.
There is such a fascinating direct lineage of belief going on here. We start way back with 18th century mesmerism, which was known as animal magnetism. As that started to fade, its remnants evolved directly into the Victorian seances of spiritualism. And ultimately, by the time we hit the 20th century, that intense desire to map the unseen human mind transformed into university-level extrasensory perception, or ESP research. It's a very clear, direct chain of evolving belief.
Now, this might surprise you, but spiritualists? They didn't see themselves as anti-science at all. Sparked in 1848 by the Fox sisters up in New York, mediums were seen as actual physical transmitters between worlds. They eagerly embraced brand new technologies, like photography, to try and capture objective empirical proof. They even attracted elite, incredibly prominent chemists like William Crookes to investigate their claims under strict observation. They actively wanted scientific validation.
Ultimately, a botanist-turned-psychologist named J.B. Rhine completely shifted the landscape in the 1920s. He moved this research entirely out of the dark seance rooms and straight into the bright university psychology labs. The movement shed its magical, spiritual roots completely. By adopting standard experimental psychology methods, statistics, and highly controlled trials, ESP researchers attempted to gain strict, unquestionable academic legitimacy.
Finally, we reach our last section, the unavoidable shadow.
So, what's the big sociological realization we need to take away from all this? Well, it's that pseudoscience is basically an unavoidable byproduct of science's competitive, ever-evolving nature. The scientific method is a brutal battleground of ideas. It naturally produces winners and losers. But here's the thing, the people behind the discarded ideas often don't just give up and go home. Those losing ideas persist, they evolve, and they are eventually labeled as pseudoscience by whatever the current consensus happens to be.
Which leads us to this honestly pretty powerful metaphor. Pseudoscience is the unavoidable shadow of scientific progress. You simply cannot have the bright light of mainstream science without casting a shadow. As our knowledge grows and the light shifts, that shadow changes its shape, morphing from alchemy to flat earth to mind powers, but the shadow never ever disappears entirely. It is a completely inherent part of the system.
I want to leave you with a final, provocative thought to chew on today. If what we've learned today holds true, and pseudoscience is truly just the shadow of scientific progress, what current, rock-solid scientific consensus that we teach in schools today is going to be labeled a defunct pseudoscience in 100 years? It's definitely something to think about. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and I'll catch you next time.